Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. As you can tell by the different mic and, of course, the ultimate fake background, absolute favorite one collected over the past few years, I'm on the road right now. Show must go on, though. I'm speaking with the author, John Ganz, about his new book, When the Clock Broke. This book is all about the early 1990s and John's idea that despite all the good things that we had at the start of that decade of my birth, the end of the Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall, the Desert Storm success, and of course, the early promise of the internet, things actually weren't looking too great. And if we look a little deeper and revise our history a bit, we can see that so much of what made the 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s such a disastrous set of decades was apparent during that period. So, hope you enjoy this revisionist approach to the decade of many of our births when it comes to the listenership of this show. Hope you enjoy the conversation. John Ganz, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks so much for having me.
This book is right up my alley because I was born in 1992. So for me, so much of my life, as we're kind of looking at the state of the country right now, is looking back on the decade of my birth through the lens of feels like things were pretty great. Things seem to have gone wrong in a bunch of different ways. So any book that kind of fits into that genre is going to be great for me. Let's start here, just as a person, separate from the book project. Like, what is your just take on the 1990s as a decade?
Well, the 1990s are remembered quite fondly and nostalgically as a time of peace and prosperity in the United States. Of course, there was an impeachment. You had a very aggressive Speaker of the House and Newt Gingrich. And you could see kind of the partisanship and polarization that the country led into, in its infancy. But by and large, it was a prosperous time. People have fond memories of things that went on in music and culture and arts. And, they're still quite nostalgic for it. The sense was the United States had won the Cold War, history had ended, and before 9/11, everything was going to kind of be like this forever. And what I found was that at the very beginning of the decade, the feeling was much, much different. The country was in an extremely insecure place, both psychologically and economically. There was a sense that things were falling apart. And that was reflected both in the politics of the era and in its pop culture. So I think that the 90s, that little moment at the beginning of the 90s is a little bit forgotten, and how tense and how fragmented it actually felt. So that's my overall take. Yeah.
What was the case for pessimism? And let's say like 91, 92, because just off the top of my head, you're going to have like the Rodney King riots. You're going to have, I guess this is why I'm sort of just struggling. It's hard to think of pessimism from a 90s perspective in the 2020s.
Yeah.
Because it seems that separate from like whether or not because everyone's always saying the stakes are at their highest in every single decade. But I just think at an empirical level, we could just list out 10 different things that are obviously higher stakes, more pessimistic. So what's the read on that from you?
Absolutely. Well, look, I mean, the life of the average middle class person over the course of the 1980s actually declined a great deal. Their wages went down. The country began to deindustrialize in the 70s and 80s. That accelerated the 90s. But then even lots of white collar jobs, ones that didn't require a college education, and then some that did require a college education started to disappear. There was a recession, and the recession of 1990, 1991 is not remembered as one of the big ones, especially after 2008. But, that came on top of decline in real wages or stagnation in real wages. And in certain parts of the country, it was really severe. You had almost, like you mentioned, the LA riots, which, by the way, was the worst single instance of civil disorder in the United States since the draft riots and the Civil War by some measures of it. Um, you know, Southern California, because of the collapse of defense spending after the Cold War and some other factors, was really undergoing almost depression conditions. You had 40% of all aerospace jobs disappeared, and there was a nationwide recession at the time, and a quarter of those job losses took place in Southern California. So the situation in LA before the riots was really dire. And it wasn't the only place in the country that was happening. You had people in the Midwest who had once, had unionized factory jobs lining up, thousands of people lining up for hotel cleaning jobs that paid fraction of what they were paid before. And you had a lot of families struggling. The age of the single income breadwinner was already well on its way out, but you had wages even in places like working for Caterpillar, which was considered a pretty good wage at $16 an hour, which by the way hasn't changed very much in the past 30 years. And families were struggling to get by on that. So there was a great deal, and then there was a sense of public corruption and an unresponsive political establishment, and part of that happened because of the savings and loan crisis. This was
John was John McCain in
John
that one?
McCain, who's part of the Keating Five. 5 senators who were very closely entangled with the savings and loan industry, and were sort of doing favors for in return for contributions and gifts. And that made a lot of people quite angry. And there was a kind of rise in anti-incumbency sentiment after that. Lots of talk radio anger at politicians. There was a broader mood of despondency and despair and nihilism. There was an enormous amount of homelessness at that time. Crime rates in cities were extremely high. So all of these factors added up to a rather gloomy moment in American history. New York in the very early 1990s, for example, it had a job losses on the level of about 500,000, and it also had the highest murder rates the city's ever seen. Around 2,000. It averaged around 2,000 murders a day in the early 1990s. I don't think people wrote, interestingly enough, that even the 1970s are considered to be really the bad time in New York City. Of course, a lot of people were writing at the time and said, this is and there was lots of also racial tension in the city. People were saying this is the worst we've ever seen it. And certainly Donald Trump, who testified to Congress, who was going bankrupt at the time, but testified to Congress, and he said, "You're kidding yourself if you think we're in a recession. We're in a depression." I mean, characteristic hyperbole aside, the real estate business in New York was doing very, very badly. So those are some of the things. Yeah, go ahead.
As I'm thinking about your answer and just looking at the book's title here at my screen, I'm really realizing that what you've done is emphasize the early 1990s, because all of the kind of vibes-based responses I have to you are actually very post-1996, right? Like I'm sure you've seen this on Twitter, but remember in the video of like the Clinton convention in 96 where they're doing the Macarena and everything seems super chill. So let's then divide this in two so we can not just get caught on a nostalgia train. How would you differentiate post 1995 90s from like the early 90s that you're really focusing on here in the book then?
Well, the recession of 1990-91 was the first of what are so-called jobless recessions, right? So there's a recovery, but there's not a lot of jobs are permanently destroyed in employment. It took until about 1996 for the recession of 1991 to return to the levels of employment that existed before. So the economy did improve under Clinton, and people were quite optimistic. And things did, I have to admit, even though I'm a critic of lots of Clinton's economic policy, for working class Americans, there are certain things that during the 1990s that it wasn't a terrible era either, even though there was, continued deindustrialization and the same kind of financial deregulation that would lead to problems later. There was a sense of prosperity. A lot of the doom and gloom that people thought, was coming out of the early 90s after the Rodney King riots and the broader sense of racial polarization and a low point in race relations in the United States didn't exactly come true.
Mhm.
I will say though that the 1990s, despite the sunny picture we have of it, this was the era of and this begins to emerge in the time of my book, of domestic terrorism in America. I mean, you have Oklahoma City.
Mhm.
This was the rise of militias. And now, those groups have
You have the Atlanta Olympic
yes,
bombing.
the
Yeah, there's
Atlanta bombing. Yep. And you also had in the very early in 1993, you had the kind of dry run, the test run of 9/11 with the attempt in the to knock over the Twin Towers in 93. So yeah, I think you have, and then there's an enormous amount of very intense conspiracism about the Clintons, which goes everywhere from the mainstream right media or right wing media like Rush Limbaugh, which is not really fringy stuff, but then has
it's like Whitewater and just real estate deals and
yes.
sort of stuff like that.
But then there was, people were saying that the Clintons killed Vince Foster and so on and so forth. And those conspiracies went from, the kinds of things you see at conspiracy conventions and gun shows, the real far right, and they went all the way into the kind of the mainstream of American conservatism. So I would say it's not I don't have a deepest knowledge of what was going on then as I do in the period of my book, but some of the things, lasted, and were more subterranean, but they were still there. And the militia movement in particular, which really took off in the 90s, that today has a lot of political salience, because those were the kinds of people who showed up on January 6th. I mean, most people who showed up on January 6th were just interested in Trump and were not previously a part of these movements, but the groups like the 3%ers and so on and forth, and have roots back to the 1990s and before. So
the key thing then is there's an easy way of kind of interpreting this conversation, which is the kind of revisionist. Marshall, you're born in 1992. You were, decently economically privileged. So it's like easy for you to act as if everything was fine. But actually, there are always like little undercurrents of events that sort of don't fit our nostalgic story. But that's true for almost any decade. What you're focused on in the book is a specific role of like con men and conspiracy within that broader story. So bring that part in here. So this is more than just, hey, there was a recession that was bad and you forgot about it. Go deeper on this.
For sure. So a very specific type of politics emerges in this period, right? So in 1991, you have David Duke run for governor of Louisiana. Louisiana had been having economic problems for longer. It suffered throughout the whole 80s, so it was a little ahead of the rest of the country. And he did surprisingly well. This is a man who had been a neo-Nazi. He had been a Grand Wizard of the Klan. And this should have doomed him in American politics, but he won the Republican nomination in an open primary for governor. He lost the election, but he won a majority of the white vote. And what was very interesting is that the Republican establishment in DC really threw a lot of resources in trying to stop him, because they thought that he was a real liability for them and were very frightened of what he represented. And they struggled with that. His constituency was really behind him. And after this happens,
great question, because I don't know.
Sure.
I know it's not a talking point because it actually happened. I know that David Duke ran a surprisingly strong gubernatorial race.
Yeah.
What was he running as, right? Like, was this, I'm David Duke, and obviously I have this history, but here are these things that are happening in your world now. Like, what was his candidacy?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a really good question. In large part, he presented himself as a conservative Republican, and he did not present policies that were that different from a lot of conservative Republicans, kind of tough on crime, against affirmative action, against welfare set-asides. He was definitely more of a protectionist on trade, and was not such a free marketer. But he had a kind of austerity, not austerity focus, because he wanted to preserve certain parts of, Louisiana's sort of populist dispensation for the middle class. But he definitely wanted to cut programs that would say benefit certain parts of the population. So in a lot of his rhetoric, he wasn't terribly different from a conservative Republican, except much more willing to go up to the racial core of these issues, to talk about eugenics, and then also to talk about quite conspiratorial things about globalism, and, which have become a much bigger part of right-wing mainstream politics. So he was a bit of a hybrid in that he could slip under the radar in a certain way because certain things he said and expressed himself did not sound terribly different from most Republicans, but there were things at the margins that were more some things you would associate with the farther right. And then there was just the fact of who he was. People knew what David Duke had been. I mean, he had been the face, insofar as there was one, of the Ku Klux Klan for a long time. So he was almost a symbol of a rejection of a consensus about what was acceptable in American politics. And Reagan, did radio spots against him. The RNC sent people down against him. Bush, when he was president, spoke against him, and they couldn't stop him. And when this happened, sections of the American right and the hard right and the far right are very excited about it, and they see this as a signal almost that a moment had arrived. So you have Pat Buchanan, who's a long-standing figure on the American right, American conservative movement. In this period, is kind of moving ever rightwards. He says at one point the biggest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan, and I guess he kind of views himself as occupying that. And he very explicitly sees the Duke campaign as the moment where he should launch his primary campaign against Bush, running on a kind of America first, return to the pre-war right. A right-wing populism that is protectionist, that is not so interested in free trade, that is certainly not interested in being parts of multilateral global arrangements, that's quite hostile towards immigration, and is not so thrilled about the influx of prominent Jews into the conservative movement and the people of the neoconservatives. And he views his campaign as very much a struggle against that faction of the conservative movement. And what follows from that is a moment in which David Duke kind of kicks off or signals of a right-wing populist revolt. This kind of transitions into a broader thing that's sort of subcultural. Conservatives are interested in it, but some people who are not conservatives, they're or wouldn't identify as conservatives, it does echo with them. But then you have Ross Perot, right? And Ross Perot is not. I mean, he's very clearly a creature of the right in certain ways, but that's not how he runs.
Here's the thing.
Yeah.
He's right wing. He's not conservative. There's like a distinction between those two things.
Precisely. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about a lot of the figures that emerge in my book, is that they are right wingers, but they either don't bother to call themselves conservatives, or they in fact deliberately reject that label as being not what they're about and being insufficient to meet the challenges that they believe the United States was undergoing.
Yeah, which is, kind of funny because this is a good go to the present day and ask you what you think about another relevant third party candidate. Because I think that RFK Jr. is like exactly in this category of, he's not a Republican, he's not a conservative, but he's definitely, I think, in his current iteration, kind of right wing. So yeah. If you agree with that articulation there, what is it about the American political system in the late 20th and then early 21st century that creates this minority but real like window of folks who are interested in the right wing but not conservative critique of the established system? Like, what's like the dual tie-in between those two categories? Because what I'm basically getting at here is that right wing but not conservative is much more viable from a third party perspective than like left wing but not a Democrat or conventional liberal?
Yes. Yeah, that's really an interesting question. I think that there is an enormous amount of people in the United States whose instincts are small c conservative. They have a belief in, you know, preserving a certain social order, a certain vision of the middle class as it existed before, and they view the establishment in Washington, corporate America, as hostile to that and as kind of dissolving those things and the material and the cultural basis of that as being under threat. So they have intrinsically right wing leanings, but the conservatism of the traditional Republican Party, insofar as it's very close with corporate business interests, has not so much to say to them.
Yep.
And they may be in industries that say have been hurt by trade, you know, free trade. They may live in rural communities where deindustrialization has happened. The message of the Republican Party, in some of its cultural side, may appeal to them or more like what they want to hear. But in terms of its economic policy, there's not a huge constituency for it. You know, I always said that kind of Donald Trump was a constituency without a program, and the Republicans were a program without a constituency. And I think that Republicans have constantly misread the grassroots right wing dissatisfaction with the country as their policy prescriptions as being the answer to it. And I think with Trump, they finally got the answer to that, which was, no, we don't really like what you're saying to us. We have something else in mind. In terms of so I do think that there is a large part of the country that, as you're saying, is right wing, but not really part of the conservative movement. Perot, certainly RFK Jr. Now, but you know, RFK
Joe
Jr.
Rogan, Joe Rogan is also part of this category too.
Absolutely. I think that what you have in the person of Donald Trump, and why, you know, look, Ross Perot wins almost 20% of the vote. It's a remarkable performance he doesn't win any state, but he wins 20% of the vote. It's a remarkable performance.
And one quick thing that should be noted when we're evaluating that was after he did his stupid drop out for a month thing. So like there's actually like a world where he didn't let his right. But to be fair, that's also telling Ross Perot to not be Ross Perot. So it's not that useful an intellectual exercise. But like that said, like 20% with dropping out publicly is pretty impressive.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's right. He dropped out. His negatives went way up, but he still did pretty well. I think the thing about Trump is, and this is where I think people might find my book interesting, is that Trump, to me, is a third party candidate. You know, he comes from the world of Ross Perot's Reform Party, which is one of the places that he tried to launch a political career before. He was hanging around the Tea Party movement, which was a dissident kind of movement within the Republican Party to attack and primary, establishment Republicans. And he kind of attacks the Republican Party from outside, and he has third party energy. He attracts a lot of the people who might vote for a third party. Now, he's been in power now, and people maybe are disillusioned with him, especially, you know, lots of people who are not thrilled about vaccines, which is a natural constituency for RFK Jr., obviously. Trump is able, or was able, to do something I call the anywhere constituency strategy, which is Republicans traditionally did what John McCain did when they were confronted with weird stuff. You know, a woman goes up to John McCain, calls Obama a Muslim, and he says, no, we don't say this kind of thing.
It's actually even stupider than that. She says he's an Arab.
He's an Arab. Right. Yeah.
It was actually much dumber.
His answer is a little weird to that, because he was like, he's a decent American, which, you know,
actually, we're going to do some historical. I saw a good tweet on this recently. Someone convinced me that if you take the words that he used and put it on paper, there's a comma. No, he's not, comma, he's a decent man. Not he's saying like he can't be an Arab. He's a decent man.
Right.
Those things are different. So I've been, this
Right,
is
right, right,
a
right.
low, I could be convinced. I hadn't thought of it. I was like, you know what?
Well,
That's
he
a compelling
understood
thing.
what she was trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
she was
yeah, he's an
she was trying to
alien.
just smear him as a
Yeah.
racial other or whatever, you know. And he was like, no, he's a good, you know, he stood up for him. Trump, when people confront him with that kind of stuff, just go, okay, sounds good. You know, any kind, it doesn't matter how insane it is. He just says, yeah, we're going to look into that. That's very interesting. And he cobbles together a coalition of people, often who are used to kind of getting the treatment of being like your crackpot or crank. And then they think this guy is our champion. You know, I'm sure personally Donald Trump doesn't give it a second thought and thinks these people are morons. Donald Trump definitely has no problem taking vaccines. You know, I don't think that he's actually believes in a lot of the things that he does, but he's sensitive to, you know, understand that a lot of these people just want to be listened to. So he kind of cobbles together a winning coalition the first time around by getting these, you know, these groups that usually feel really alienated from the American political establishment. I mean, like, you know, this is the first candidate in a very long time, Republican candidate in a very long time at the real extreme right in the United States, which usually just sits out of elections or votes for really tiny third parties. They said, this is our guy. This is our guy. This is exactly the kind of things we want to hear. So to me, Trump is almost shows the formula for how a third party candidate can win, which is you just have to take over a part. You know, you have to take over one of the parties.
Well,
Yeah.
no, and I'm glad you said that, because you're actually getting to a core of how, in a weird political animal way, I respect Donald Trump. Because the thing that I just don't respect about Ralph Nader, and that I don't respect about a lot of people who tend to be, and this is also RFK Jr., who get pulled into like the third party kind of crank nexus, is that like oftentimes like their political critiques are pretty incoherent and not particularly smart. Like I actually just think it was a ridiculous take that Ralph Nader could advance the idea in 2000 that the parties were the same. Like obviously in retrospect that looks dumb, but I think even at the time, I think that was really like an example of like malignant narcissism and him wanting to really sort of like crest out and get a lot of attention. Versus Donald Trump, who has his own narcissistic tendencies. It should be noted, Trump doesn't actually run for the Reform Party banner because he realizes it's not going to work. Trump,
it's a waste of time.
The way people tell his story is like, oh, like for decades, Trump said he was going to run for president and then he didn't run. And it's because he sort of can stay focused, but it's actually like he waited until he actually got the thesis right, which is, okay, I can make these concessions to like the normal Republican set of things, aka I don't actually care about the Supreme Court. It doesn't animate my politics. So sure, I will quite literally tell the Federalist Society they will get their appointees if they do it. There was not an option like that for 2000s Trump. He then says though, but here, and he's not exactly reading like Reformicon, Ross Douthat, Reihan Salam literature, but like here are some ways that like I could critique the Republican Party status quo, Iraq war, entitlement, and this is what's again different than what he actually does when he's president, but Iraq war, entitlement spending, tax cuts over everything else, and still survive and get the actual votes. Well, also, like, so that's just where I really respect him, because the other third party candidates, and this is also RFK Jr.'s problem. He should never run for the Democratic Party's primary because it's just a waste of time. He, in no way does he speak to any constituency in the modern 2020s Democratic Party primary. But then when it also comes to the like broader sort of set here, I think he's in a weird space because I think his message, I think focusing his message around vaccines and COVID is just sort of like 2 to 3 years like out of touch of where the country is. I'm curious how you think about this dynamic.
Yes, I think that's really well observed. I do think that you have to kind of give it up to Donald Trump in terms of his sense of timing and his observation of the political winds. I think that his sense of politics comes somewhat, his critique of the Republican Party comes somewhat farther to the right. I know you say he probably wasn't reading Reformicon literature. I mean, that's certainly true, but I think that he echoes a right-wing populist critique of the Republican Party that has its, you know, one edge in Pat Buchanan for a very long time, and maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's leftmost edge in someone like Pat Buchanan, and it goes all the way right to Aryan nations, right?
Mhm.
So, which is basically the Republican Party is selling out white people. It's betraying as America as a example of Western civilization, which is the way that somebody like Pat Buchanan might put it. The idea of building a wall and putting the National Guard on the wall. These are ideas that you used to kind of hear Tom Metzger from the Ku Klux Klan talking about, and these things are not, we're not the thing that Trump realized is, those may be things that people on the extreme right talk about, but they're not going to sound that weird to people. They might actually sound good to people, but the messenger hasn't been right. So, and it certainly, the after the failure in Iraq, paleoconservatives, the isolationist part of the right had a long-standing critique of neoconservatism and American interventionism abroad in general. And Trump begins to play some of that music. Now, what he does in office is a little different, of course, but Trump begins to play some of those hits on the campaign trail. Not something you really expected a Republican candidates were so built into this way of thinking that there were certain things shibboleths that you had to speak. Like they all believed you had to be more gung-ho than the next guy about foreign intervention and being a hawk. And Trump was
Yep.
just like, no, it's stupid. So yeah, he absolutely saw these weak points where the constituency and the grassroots of the Republican Party was in a much different place than its politicians, and they were where he was at, or what. Also, Trump, I think it's worth pointing out. I've discussed this recently on another program. He does politics in a very different way from other politicians. Other politicians sit around with advisors and shape messages. Trump kind of does this on the fly. Like he responds to crowds. He understands what's animating them. He leads them, but he's also kind of like a DJ or a comedian where he gets the vibe of the crowd and he can see what they like. And then he starts to say that more and repeat it. He can see what they don't like. And he's very good. He has this symbiotic, organic relationship with his crowd, which is very rare for a politician. Now, with all that being said, the constituency, the core, the base that was responsive to all these things so far has not added up to a majority of the American people. So he has like a highly coherent group that's very amenable to his appeal and the way he politics, but it's very hard for him to change out of that almost subcultural. It's bigger than a subculture. It's part of mass culture now. But definitely not a majority of the American people. And when he doesn't like it, when he gets advisors and then Perot had the same problem when they're trying to get him to read the teleprompter and say this and do that and act like a normal politician. But there's a certain wisdom behind that kind of stuff because those rote things kind of get you over 50% sometimes.
Here's something I'm curious about. So no matter what happens in 2024, knock on wood on a couple different levels, but Trump and Biden will not be the nominee of either party in 2028. So we're going through this interesting generational change moment.
Trump may still be president in 2028.
Yeah, fair, entirely fair. So 2029, we'll advance that a bit. But you're describing this cracked up America that emerged in the early 1990s. And something I'm kind of really curious about as someone who swims in like very, very, very establishment circles, but still engages with work like your own is, at what point do you think the establishment will figure out how to navigate waters in a space like this. So like, for example, I actually totally get if you're a Tip O'Neill type or even like a different iteration of Joe Biden type who experiences the conspiracy theorism and like the broken mass culture, the con manism, all these different kind of categories. At a certain point, it feels as if the establishment is going to figure out how to navigate those political dynamics, but it also feels like in many ways it kind of hasn't. I'd be curious like how you think about like, if we're all children of the 90s, then at what point is this just the world we live in and we're not trying to replicate a 70s or an 80s or a 60s that won't come by again?
I don't know. It's a really tough one. I think basically what the Republicans have done is just to form an epoxy and glue themselves to Trump because they realize that he's kind of the only guy that can do it. So they're in this.
There's a reason why he's outrunning all the Senate candidates in the swing states.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. He has an appeal that goes far beyond their, and they get that. They know that. It's a little as we were just mentioning earlier. It's a little bit of a catch-22 because he's also turns a lot of people off. But he's the best thing they've got going.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way to do it is that they just have this kind of thing in their pocket now. It's not in their pocket. He's kind of they're in his pocket in a certain way.
And sometimes if you're part of that Jew, and this is why I was never one for the fainting couch over the how could you support Trump again crowd, because actually like if you're looking what actually happened during the 4 years of the presidency, especially the 3 years before COVID, you got like 80 to 90% of what you actually wanted.
If you're a right-wing Republican, for sure.
Therefore, like, if Trump doesn't care about the thing that you care about, then you kind of get your way. That's kind of like the funny example there.
Yeah, he understands coalition politics. And he understands that those constituencies need to be served. Those constituencies are much more powerful because they're actually transactional. He has another constituency just like hangs on his every word and loves him. But, people like evangelical voters or people who are very concerned about abortion, they went into that relationship with conditions, and he signaled. I remember in the debate in 2016, the Supreme Court came up and he just had this line that was the Supreme Court. It's what it's all about. And it sounds like idiotic on one hand, but that's just such a simple way of telling those voters, like, I got you. And I think that is a big part of it too, is that he does know how to play coalition politics and deliver for those constituencies on issues that he probably just doesn't give a shit one way or the other. I mean, he knows how to run for president now. He has many strengths and he has many, many weaknesses. I don't exactly know like the similar thing has not happened, obviously, and cannot happen just because of the way liberals are in the country and what they represent. You can't, like, the Democrats could not, like, say, hitch themselves to some Huey Long type fake. I mean, they kind of had to, like, with Bernie Sanders, who never got to the position of being the leader of the party, and it would look a lot different then. They worked out a deal with him, but Bernie, like, as much as I very much like him, he subordinates himself to party leadership because he's not an insane narcissist in the way that Trump is. Trump would never.
He's also interested in policy outcomes.
Yes,
that Trump has done. So, like, and this is not an endorsement of democratic socialism, but with Bernie Sanders is actually I will say, like, Bernie's a great coalition partner from a more center left perspective, or center from like mine, which is that, he cares about this, and that. So, like, make some concessions to him, especially during COVID relief, expand the child tax credit, and he'll be like, okay, it's not everything, but like that's a real tangible thing. Trump has no equivalent. There's definitely there's a version of Trump who like actually cares about the wall in an empirical sense, who wakes up saying like, I measure the number of border crossings per day. But that isn't his approach when it comes to policy.
Not at all. Yeah. And Bernie is called a populist sometimes, but he's really an institutionalist. Like he was notable among progressives as being someone who wasn't really that thrilled about the idea of getting rid of the filibuster, because he kind of views himself, I think, as representing a dissident strain in American politics where as a senator from a certain part of the country, he can use the power of the Senate to defend the ideas that he represents, using the institutional tools that are available to him. And that kind of thinking is not something that Trump really does. He has transactionalism of a very different kind. Yeah.
So here's in this last section, something I'm really curious about. Usually running hypotheticals or alternate histories is sort of like a cheap shot, but I think in this case, it's really relevant because you're focusing on the ways that like the early 1990s experienced this like crack up of conspiracism, and like it's just like true. Like it's also like to say another 1990s tragedy. Like it's not shocking that a decade that begins and in the middle has things like Timothy McVeigh and like the first Trade Center bombing also ends with the Columbine shooting. So there's a lot going on in this decade in a way that we could easily miss. But that said, I think there's entirely a legitimate case you could make that, hey, you know what? Like if Al Gore wins and you don't invade Iraq quite in the same way, like I think clearly it would have gone into Afghanistan the way it went into Afghanistan. And there's definitely a world where a Gore administration botches Afghanistan, but I don't think the Iraq war goes down the exact same way it doesn't go down. You also have Katrina operate slightly differently. Let's say you like toggle some things with the 2008 financial crisis. What I'm basically getting at is, was all of the crack up in the early 1990s, is there like a direct and almost like not inevitable, but like obviously we would end up in an environment like ours today, or where there's these weird like alternate history moments in the 2000s, especially because I think by the 2010s things are pretty big. Probably the last 2010 thing you could have really done is maybe a better response to the 2008 financial crisis. So maybe you do, maybe you don't have like the Tea Party, maybe you do something instead of Obamacare. But how do you think about that?
It's very difficult to say. I don't think there's anything inevitable. I think there's lots of contingencies. I think what my book points out is that this is a tendency in American politics that came to the surface briefly, kind of went into remission or repose, and then the conditions reemerged for it to come out. So yes, things can always go differently. I do believe, I'm still a big believer in the idea that, after Obama's election, you were likely to get a pretty hardcore upset section of right wingers in America, for obvious reasons. So I think that's one factor that can't be ignored. Had there been, I do believe, one of my coming at this as a sort of unreconstructed New Deal Democrat, I do believe one thing that went wrong that could have made things better was the response to the 2008 financial crisis. At the time, I was like, okay, great. All this neoliberal bullshit, they're going to see it doesn't work. We're going to reconfigure things. We're going to, create institutions like there were going to before. We're going to, put some more controls on finance. We're going to get some real solid social programs. And, people hadn't, the consensus of the previous era was still really strong, about belief in markets and so on and so forth. So it didn't break quickly enough. I think, Obama didn't break quickly enough with the earlier consensus. Biden's policies actually kind of have in a lot of ways. But it comes a little, maybe too little too late. So I think that that's one thing I would point to. I think that, there could have been a stronger response to what happened in 2008 that could have headed off some of these things.
I will say, though, you just perfectly articulated the political dilemma for kind of like the post-neoliberal side, which is that, so I'm funded by the Hewlett Foundation, so I spent a lot of time like swimming in those waters. But a question I asked folks in that world recently was, so I could entirely buy a critique you offer of both like the Reagan consensus, and then Bill Clinton's acquiescence to the Reagan consensus, and then like Obama's lack of ambition, and then many laudable things the Biden administration's done. But it seems that the problem for post-neoliberals, I'd like to hear from you, is post-neoliberals may be able to come up with a policy agenda. There's basically zero evidence that that policy agenda presents itself as a successful political project. And if you're referring to yourself as a New Deal Democrat, what makes the New Deal Democrats, and frankly, just like the, FDR, Truman, Kennedy, LBJ before 66, 67 consensus so viable, is that was a successful political program.
Absolutely.
You do these things and it works. So how do you think, and then the last part of this rant, because this has been top of mind, so I'll let you close on response to this, is you could dunk on Bill Clinton all you want. His turn to the right after 1994 works.
Right.
Like it really, 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 really works as a political project. Obama is reelected in 2012. So how do you respond to this weird mix of like, I just want post-neoliberals to invest in the political side of this project far more than they have, because they're actually pretty incoherent when you push them on this, especially given how policy disinterested most people in these spaces actually are.
Yeah, I think that is an extremely fair set of criticisms and kind of the central problematic of my book in a certain way. My book stipulates that after Reagan, there was basically a crisis of legitimacy or authority of mainstream politics. They were having trouble putting together the kinds of coalitions that you would see, and that you would see like a New Deal order that would make those reconfigurations of the economy possible, that would make those sweeping policy changes possible, that have the political weight behind it. No one has really been great at articulating that message and coming up with that vision of leadership. I wish I could tell you how to do it. If I could do it, I would press a button and do it. But I do believe that the lack of that and the difficulty in coming up with that vision of national direction and leadership is the reason why something like Trump is successful, because it's a substitute for that. It steps into the gap of real. I mean, he leads this political movement that is nationalist on its surface, but doesn't actually mobilize the entirety of the nation or get majorities behind it. It's based on his personal charisma. It's not based on the idea, we have a vision for the future of the United States that's coherent, that has an economic side, that has a moral and intellectual side, and we are going to put together a coalition that includes parts of the working class, parts of capital, and this all will work for a period of time, seems to work in concert. No one has come up with that formula since, I believe, Ronald Reagan. I think Ronald Reagan's version of it was a disastrous one, but it was a hegemonic politics. I mean, he won massive elections, and massive landslides, and he was able to push through radical changes to the way, not as radical as Thatcher perhaps, but radical changes in American political economy. But yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying. It is very hard to, I think us on the left sort of believed Bernie could do it. He could not win the nomination. So, the political viability of that is in doubt. I don't know who will put together the next kind of New Deal coalition, nor do I know how the message will be articulated to the American people. But that is absolutely what is missing, which is a political vision that includes a policy regime, but it's first a viable political message and coalition that can, excite a majority of the American people. Elections are such closely run things now. The age of landslides seems to be over. There's so much polarization. I think these are all because of this crisis of legitimacy and crisis of authority that makes those are symptoms of it. But yeah, I don't know, Marshall, but I know that that's what's missing. Yeah.
I think you really identified, as we close here, what I think my central critique of the center left to left in the post-Obama era, which is that there was just this hyper hyper focus on discrete policy questions, which I think in many ways is like a good faith, good thing. Like, it's pretty cool. There was like a very serious debate about single payer healthcare and like the path to like succeeding Obamacare. But I think what the Biden, and this is also, by the way, why the Biden administration, why Biden is still the nominee.
Yeah.
Because I think Biden, through just reality of his political career, is one of the last remaining establishment politicians who has like a coherent model of who he is and what he does. And what the New York Times editorial board and like pundits like ourselves underestimated in 2020 was just like how compelling that thing was. But it's a one and done thing. You can't replicate Joe Biden at a very literal level. And I think that what folks should be spending more time thinking about is what you articulated there, which is like, what are the actual politics we're embodying, which is a little different than what's my like policy plank, because it's actually quite different. The presentation, and that's where I think smart people are going to be like positioning themselves with.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, like, one way to think about this is like, Biden is a Democrat. He remembers what it means to be a Democrat. And that means he remembers the era where the party was really powerful. It was kind of a machine, but it would also like go out and fight every 2 to 4 years and come up with a message and, come back with a majority in the House every year, and then remember the era of, great Democratic presidents winning. I think like a lot of people, he's a Democrat. This is the way I would put it. He's a Democrat first and a liberal second, right? And Obama, I think, he's a liberal in the, not perhaps so much in the American sense, but maybe more in the European sense. He's a liberal first and a Democrat second, in the sense that he has a worldview that's guided by certain ideas about policy, about the certain ways in which, policy outcomes are worked out through the political system, through compromise. But, essentially, this is the way things work. He's a very talented politician, has a gift for message. But I think that too many Democrats are liberals first and think in terms of policy, these kind of like, oh, well, we'll convince people this will work out with statistics. We'll convince the people this will work out better for them. And they're not Democrats in the sense, both small d and big D sense, in the sense that they don't have enough of a partisan enough identity. And they don't think about politics in terms of like, we're going to get people behind, we're going to get the masses behind us, and we're going to win a big election, So,
but you just articulated the Bernie trap, though. Which is the Bernie trap, and this is why I'm fascinated by like political, because like I was like a student government, YMCA Youth and Government Student Congress try hard in high school. So like I very much like my milieu is like the people who are into stuff like that. So I always like think about things through those lenses. So I'm interested in like, so for example, it's interesting to me that like a lot of like my peers in the 2000s have now grown up, and like when they present, they're very like activist-y. Like in terms of like, we're an activist, like we're like a movement leader, and that's the Bernie theory. The issue though is that like the activist presentation style, especially in Democratic primaries that are crowded with moderates, and then people to your sort of like center, like Elizabeth Warren, is that doesn't actually work.
No, I don't think I don't like that either. I think Bernie's actually different from that, but I understand what you're saying. I think the activist vocabulary, the activist presentation, I think Bernie has a more folksy, broad appeal, which gets independents interested in stuff like that. I think he has a different message. I understand what you're saying. The progressive activist argot is unappealing to a lot of people who just don't either turns them off or like, that's very different. That's a sub problem, which it dogs progressive politics, and I don't particularly care for it. No, I think that's really different. I think one reason why Biden was successful is because he doesn't speak that language. Again, he speaks an older language. AOC may have started to speak that language, but at the beginning of her career, didn't.
Yep.
And
she's protesting with Sunrise. She's protesting the speaker with Sunrise Movement.
Yeah. And I think that she began with a kind of vocabulary, and my buddy Rick Perlstein pointed this out as a pundit writing about her earlier in her career. she spoke. The American what American liberals and progressives, Democrats have to do is to seize the center symbols of American politics again. So she was talking about Lincoln and the founders and all this stuff, and Obama did this too, and reweaving this into a left leaning story. Right? It's possible to do that. I grew up with that. I saw it. I grew up taught with a very progressive but institutional, type of politics, which is not popular on the left. We were taught the Supreme Court under the Warren Court was a great thing. There was this kind of progressive constitutionalism. America is always getting better, and the institutions are the way in which that happens. And, with the critiques of American institutions coming from the left, I think of the undemocratic parts of the Supreme Court, of the Senate, these are all fair and I share them to a certain degree. But there was a power in this understanding of American institutions and symbols as having an intrinsically progressive function or possibility, which I think some people on the left, both on the progressive activist left and then the farther left populist left, have kind of soured on and don't share, and I think that actually makes it very hard to win.
Yeah, two things in response, then we'll actually close out. So one, sure. I think my just sort of, I've been doing lots of studying about specific decades and understanding their meaning. And my just kind of take advice to people left of center, and actually to some people on the center left, is that there's just this very 60s deconstructionist project that I think just needs to come to a close. That's very much just sort of okay, so let's interrogate American institutions, let's interrogate the flag, let's interrogate X, Y, and Z thing. And I think that if it's the 60s and you're in the middle of the Vietnam War and McNamara is, driving defense policy into a ditch, I understand a lot of the need to deconstruct, but I think we're just running on fumes from a deconstruction perspective. And whatever insights there are there, with which there actually are clear insights, we've probably gotten them. But two, I just smiled to myself when you mentioned how President Obama would kind of speak to this need to adopt these symbols. But my critique of Obama has always been that there's always been just too much of the wry professor. So for example, he would say, and I'm not trying to be a boomer con here, but when he did his oh, of course I believe in American exceptionalism, just as the Greeks believe, he just couldn't resist the urge to deconstruct even within his kind of thing. So that was just sort of a funny reading of Obama I have. But this has been really, really fun, John. The book is pleasure. When the Clock Broke. Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. I love the cover. Great cover.
Thanks so much.
I hope folks check that out.
Thank you so much, Marshall.